house my father built in Mexico was meant to be his sanctuary, a dream realized in the twilight of his life. But when he entrusted it to his brother Herman, he unknowingly opened the door to a nightmare that would follow us across oceans. Every visit my father made to that house left him weaker and sicker, until one day, the doctors in the United States found nothing wrong, and the whispers of dark forces began. As my father fought a losing battle with a mysterious illness, I was drawn into a horrifying secret involving a demonic curse, a greedy relative, and a debt that could never be repaid. The story starts now. What I'm about to share is something I wish I could forget, something that haunts me every day. My father worked tirelessly to build a house in Mexico, far away from our home in the United States. It was his dream to retire there, to spend his last days in peace under the warm sun. But that dream quickly turned into a nightmare. Since my father only visited Mexico occasionally, he decided to let his favorite brother, Luis, live in the house. It made sense. After all, who better to trust than his own brother? My father was confident that Luis would take care of the place, that there would never be any problems since he was family. So, Luis moved into my father's brand new home, everything inside still shining with newness. Whenever my father visited, he stayed at the house. But there was one strange thing. He always fell ill during his visits. Each time, without fail, he'd return to the United States sicklier than before. Maybe you shouldn't visit Mexico so often, Luis suggested one day. Why not let me have the house? It seems like living here isn't good for your health. You're better off staying in the US. My father immediately shot down the idea. That's never going to happen. You couldn't afford the house, Luis. Where would you get the money? I'd rather sell the house than just give it away like it cost nothing. I worked hard, blood, sweat, and tears to build that place. If I can't live there, then I'll sell it. My father's voice was filled with sadness. His dream of retiring in Mexico seemed further away than ever, especially since this strange illness plagued him every time he visited. After his last visit, my father returned to the US, but this time he didn't get better. In fact, he grew sicker and sicker despite being back home. He slept all day, felt constantly miserable, vomited, had diarrhea, headaches, body aches, an overall sense of malaise. He visited doctor after doctor, but no one could find anything wrong. Every test came back normal. Every blood result was fine. Every organ was functioning perfectly. One day, a family friend suggested taking my father to see a voodoo priest, a healer in Los Angeles, who might be able to help. Desperate, I accompanied my father to the healer. As soon as we arrived, the voodoo priest told us that if my father hadn't come to see him, he might not have survived another day. My father was on the brink of death, not from any physical illness, but because someone had used black magic against him. The voodoo priest explained that a malevolent spirit, a demon, was attached to my father, making him sick. He said he knew exactly who had done this, but refused to name them. It's someone who wants your house, the voodoo priest said. He also mentioned that my father had eaten something cursed, something that was still inside him, causing all these problems. The demon was working from within his body, slowly killing him. The voodoo priest suggested performing a cleansing ritual, Olympia, to free my father from this demonic curse. At first, my father didn't believe a word of it. He refused to go through with the ritual. Maybe it was the influence of the dark magic clouding his judgment. Or maybe he was just too rational to accept something so supernatural. But I begged him to do it. I couldn't bear the thought of losing him, not like this. After much pleading, he finally agreed. That very day, the voodoo priest performed the limpia. I'm not exaggerating when I say that almost immediately, I saw a change in my father. He started to feel better, and over the next few days, he seemed to regain his strength. With renewed energy, my father called his brother Luis in Mexico and informed him that the house had been sold and he needed to move out. Well, you wouldn't believe the vile things Luis said to him. He cursed at my father like an animal, screaming that he wouldn't leave, that he had no intention of moving out. Despite my father's insistence, Luis stubbornly remained in the house, acting as if it belonged to him. My father hired a lawyer to apply more pressure, but Luis made things incredibly difficult for us. He fought us every step of the way, refusing to leave, dragging the process out for as long as he could. It cost us a fortune in legal fees, and still, Luis refused to budge. He came up with every trick in the book to stay in that house, knowing full well the pain he was causing my father. Before all of this, my father and Luis had a great relationship. My father loved his brother dearly and often sent him care packages from the US. Whenever Luis needed anything, my father did his best to provide it, despite the high cost of living here. But it was clear that Luis believed we had money growing on trees, that my father would just hand over a house worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Luis continued his vicious campaign, even calling my father out of the blue to curse him out. He was convinced that he had a right to that house, even though he hadn't paid a cent for it and couldn't afford to. We couldn't understand where he got the audacity to think he deserved it. This entire ordeal had a profound impact on my father. He became depressed, deeply disappointed in his brother. He slept poorly, constantly worried, and was frequently sick. It broke my heart to see him like this. Then, about a year later, something unexpected happened. Luis suddenly fell gravely ill. He became paralyzed, unable to care for himself. Naturally, he could no longer stay in the house. Finally, he was out, and shortly afterward, the house was sold. But just when we thought the nightmare was over, things took a darker turn. One night, after the house was sold, my father received a call. It was Luis, but his voice was weak, almost unrecognizable. "I need to talk to you," he whispered. "Come to the house, please. I have to tell you something." My father hesitated, but decided to go. He asked me to accompany him, and I agreed, though I had an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. We arrived at the house late at night. The air was thick with tension, and the once beautiful home now seemed sinister, its walls holding on to dark secrets. We found Luis lying in the same room where my father used to sleep during his visits. His face was pale, his body frail, but his eyes were wild, filled with something between fear and desperation. "You need to know the truth," he began, his voice trembling. "I didn't just curse you for the house. I did something far worse." Luis paused, struggling to breathe. "When you first built this house, I was jealous. I wanted what you had, so I made a pact. I summoned something dark, something evil, and in return, I was supposed to take everything from you: your health, your happiness, even your life." My father and I stood frozen, the room growing colder with each word he spoke. But I didn't realize the full cost of what I had done. The demon didn't just want to take from you. It wanted to take from me too. I've been seeing things, hearing whispers in the night. It's been waiting for me to fulfill my end of the deal. And now, it's coming for me. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and a gust of icy wind blew through the room, though the windows were closed. Luis's eyes widened in terror. "It's here," he gasped, struggling to sit up. "You have to help me, please. I can't face it alone." But before we could react, the room was plunged into darkness. A low growl echoed from the shadows, and the temperature dropped even further. I felt a cold hand brush against my arm, but when I turned, there was nothing there. Luis screamed, a blood-curdling sound that pierced through the silence. In the dim light, I could see something emerging from the darkness. A figure, tall and twisted, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. It reached out for Luis, and as it did, the room seemed to close in on us, the walls warping and the air thickening with a sense of impending doom. My father tried to pull Luis out of bed, but it was too late. The demon seized him, and with one final scream, Luis was gone, his body evaporating into the air as if he had never been there. The figure turned its gaze towards us, and for a moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if it was measuring us, deciding if we were worth its attention. But then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, and the room returned to normal, the temperature rising, the lights steadying. We were left standing there, shaken and horrified, unsure if what we had seen was real or just a collective nightmare. My father and I fled the house that night, leaving everything behind. We never spoke of it again, not to each other, not to anyone. The house was sold, and we tried to move on with our lives. But something had changed. My father was no longer the man he used to be. The light in his eyes had dimmed, and there was a permanent shadow over him. But the most chilling part came later. A few weeks after the incident, my father received a letter in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with words scrawled in a shaky hand. "The debt is never fully paid." From that day forward, my father was never the same. He became paranoid, convinced that the demon was still out there, waiting for its next opportunity. And sometimes, late at night, I could hear him whispering to himself, begging for forgiveness, as if trying to ward off something unseen. The nightmare hadn't ended with Luis's death. It had only just begun. Before we continue with the second part of this story, don't forget to hit that like button for us. Let's continue with the story. After that fateful night, life was never the same for my father or me. We tried to bury the memories, to pretend that what we had experienced was nothing more than a shared hallucination brought on by stress and fear. But deep down, we both knew better. There was no denying the reality of what we had seen, and more importantly, the consequences of it. My father's paranoia grew with each passing day. He would often lock himself in his room for hours, emerging only to check the locks on the doors and windows repeatedly, as if he were expecting someone or something to break in. He started sleeping with the lights on and refused to talk about what happened, even when I tried to bring it up. The letter he had received, with the ominous message that the debt is never fully paid, haunted him relentlessly. I'd find him staring at it sometimes, the piece of paper crumpled in his trembling hands. I, too, was on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that the demon was still lurking, biding its time. I often felt a cold presence, especially at night when the house was silent. I thought about moving out, putting as much distance between myself and the house as possible, but I couldn't leave my father alone in his fragile state. One night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I was jolted awake by a loud bang. I rushed out of bed and found my father standing in the living room, staring at the front door. It was wide open, swaying slightly in the breeze, though we had both made sure it was locked before going to bed. "Did you open it?" I asked, my voice shaky. My father didn't respond. He just stood there, his eyes fixed on something beyond the door, something I couldn't see. I moved closer, my heart pounding in my chest. "Dad?" I touched his arm gently, trying to snap him out of whatever trance he was in. He finally turned to look at me, and the fear in his eyes made my blood run cold. "It's here," he whispered. "It's back." I quickly closed the door, locking it securely. "We need to leave," I said. "We can't stay here." But my father shook his head. "It won't matter. It'll follow us. No matter where we go, it'll find us." We spent the rest of the night huddled together in the living room, the lights on, both of us too scared to go back to sleep. The next morning, we decided to leave the house for good. We packed our things and moved to a small apartment on the other side of town. I hoped that by leaving the house, we could escape whatever dark force had attached itself to us. For a while, it seemed like things were getting better. My father started to relax a little, and the paranoia that had gripped him so tightly began to loosen its hold. But the relief was short-lived. One evening, a few weeks after we moved into the apartment, I found my father sitting at the kitchen table, staring at something in his hand. It was another letter, identical to the first, with the same chilling message: "The debt is never fully paid." "How did this get here?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I don't know," my father replied, his face pale. "It was just here when I got home." That night, the nightmare started. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, my mind filled with images of the demon that had taken Luis. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and I began hearing whispers in the dark, low, indistinct voices that seemed to come from just beyond the walls. One night, I awoke to the sound of my father screaming. I rushed into his room and found him thrashing in his bed, his face contorted in terror. I shook him awake, and he looked at me with wild eyes, his chest heaving. "It was here," he gasped. "It was right here, standing over me. It was trying to drag me away." I didn't know what to do. I felt helpless, terrified that this thing would eventually claim us both. We couldn't escape it, no matter where we went or how hard we tried. The demon had marked us, and there was no running from it. The following days were a blur of fear and exhaustion. Neither of us slept much, too afraid of what might happen if we let our guard down. I started researching everything I could find about demons, curses, and ways to break them. Most of what I found seemed like nonsense, but I was desperate. I came across a forum where people shared their experiences with similar supernatural occurrences. One post caught my attention. It was from someone who claimed to have been haunted by a demon for years, and they said the only way to end it was to confront it directly, to return to the place where it all started and perform a ritual to banish it for good. I showed the post to my father, but he was reluctant. "We don't even know if that'll work," he said. "And what if it makes things worse?" Can things really get worse than this? I replied. We're barely holding on as it is. We have to try something. After much convincing, my father agreed. We packed our bags once more and returned to Mexico, to the house where this all began. The new owners had already moved in, but when we explained our situation, they surprisingly allowed us to perform the ritual. They seemed just as eager to rid the house of any lingering darkness as we were. The ritual was to take place at midnight, the witching hour, when the veil between the worlds was thinnest. We set up everything we needed in the living room: candles, a circle of salt, and various other items recommended in the ritual instructions. My father was visibly shaking, but he stood firm, determined to see this through. As the clock struck midnight, we began the ritual, chanting the incantations we had memorized. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with an oppressive energy that made it hard to breathe. The candles flickered wildly, and the temperature dropped, just as it had the night Luis disappeared. Then, just as we reached the final part of the ritual, the room was plunged into darkness. The candles were snuffed out by an unseen force, and the cold wind we had felt before returned, more intense than ever. The walls seemed to close in on us, and the whispers started again, louder this time, more insistent. "Stop the ritual," my father whispered, his voice trembling. "It's making it angry." But I couldn't stop now. We had come too far. I continued chanting, my voice growing louder, more desperate. The whispers turned into screams, and suddenly, the figure from before appeared in the room, more menacing and terrifying than I remembered. It towered over us, its eyes burning with an otherworldly light. The figure lunged at my father, and I screamed, reaching out to pull him away. But I was too late. The demon grabbed him, and my father let out a blood-curdling scream as he was lifted off the ground. I watched in horror as the demon's grip tightened around him, the life draining from his face. In that moment, something inside me snapped. I grabbed the final item needed for the ritual, a small, ancient dagger that had been passed down through our family for generations, and plunged it into the demon's chest, shouting the last line of the incantation with every ounce of strength I had left. There was a blinding flash of light, and the demon let out an unearthly roar. The room shook violently, and for a moment, I thought we were both going to die. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The demon was gone, and my father collapsed to the floor, unconscious, but alive. I rushed to his side, shaking him until he opened his eyes. "Dad, are you okay?" He nodded weakly, his eyes wide with shock. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked around the room, half expecting the demon to reappear, but there was nothing. The oppressive energy was gone, and the room felt strangely calm. "I think so," I replied, though I wasn't entirely sure. We stayed in the house for the rest of the night, too exhausted to move, but also too afraid to leave until we were certain the demon wouldn't return. As dawn broke, we finally allowed ourselves to relax, the first rays of sunlight dispelling the last remnants of fear that had gripped us for so long. We returned to the United States later that day, hoping that we had finally put an end to the nightmare. But the experience had left its mark on both of us. My father was never the same. The trauma of what he had endured weighed heavily on him, and he withdrew into himself, rarely speaking of the events that had transpired. As for me, I tried to move on, to to rebuild my life, but the memories lingered. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the demon's face, felt its cold presence, heard the whispers that had once filled the darkness. I couldn't shake the feeling that, even though we had banished it, the demon wasn't truly gone. It was out there somewhere, waiting, watching, and I couldn't escape the thought that one day it might return. Months passed, and life slowly returned to some semblance of normalcy. My father and I spoke less frequently, the distance between us growing as the weight of our shared trauma became too much to bear. I buried myself in work, trying to keep my mind occupied, but the nightmares persisted, a constant reminder of the horrors we had faced. One evening, as I was preparing for bed, my phone rang. It was my father. I answered, expecting the usual brief conversation, but his voice was different this time, strained, fearful. "It's back," he whispered. My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "The letters," he replied. "They've started coming again." I felt a cold dread settle in the pit of my stomach. How was that possible? We ended it. We did the ritual. "I don't know," my father said, his voice trembling, "but I'm scared. I don't think we can escape it this time." I booked a flight to his apartment the next day, but when I arrived, the place was empty. The door was unlocked, and inside, everything was in disarray. Furniture overturned, papers scattered across the floor. I searched every room, calling out for my father, but there was no answer. In the living room, I found the last thing I ever expected to see. There, in the center of the room, was a circle of salt, the remnants of a hastily drawn protection ward. And lying in the middle of the circle was a single sheet of paper, the same ominous message scrawled across it in dark, ink-like substance. The debt is never fully paid. I sank to my knees, my mind racing. Where had he gone? Had the demon taken him? Or had he tried to fight it on his own, believing he could end this nightmare once and for all? As I sat there, a realization hit me like a ton of bricks. The ritual we had performed, the one that was supposed to banish the demon, it hadn't worked. At least, not completely. We had merely delayed the inevitable, bought ourselves a little more time before the darkness returned. And now, it was back, hungrier and more vengeful than ever. I knew what I had to do. There was no running, no hiding from this. The only way to truly end it was to confront the demon head on, to finish what we had started. And this time, I would be ready. This time, I wouldn't stop until the demon was destroyed, no matter the cost. As I gathered the items I would need for the final confrontation, I couldn't shake the feeling that my father was still out there somewhere, fighting for his life. And if I didn't succeed, if I failed to destroy the demon once and for all, it wouldn't just be his life on the line, it would be mine, too. But as I stepped out into the night, the weight of what lay ahead heavy on my shoulders, I couldn't help but wonder, was this really a fight I could win? Or was I simply walking into a trap, doomed to repeat the same cycle of fear and despair that had consumed my family for so long? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain. I was done running. If the demon wanted to claim me, it would have to fight for it. And this time, I was prepared to fight back. Remember, if this story sent chills down your spine, make sure to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever heard of something like this happening? Do you believe in the power of dark forces? Let's discuss it together. And don't forget to subscribe for more eerie tales that will keep you up at night.